the 1980s, a former U.S. Army Green Beret and Iowa farmer moved his family to northern Idaho, seeking solace in an existence far away from what he deemed to be a wickedly corrupt society ruled by a tyrannical government. Neither a radical Nazi nor a bloodthirsty revolutionary, the man simply wanted to live a quiet Christian life without the oppression of what he saw as the dictates of a degenerate society. The man, Randy Weaver, would eventually be pressured by an undercover ATF agent posing as a local resident into sawing off a shotgun for him. When the federal agent confronted him, Weaver was given the option to inform on his neighbors in exchange for a dismissal of charges. When he refused to serve as a snitch, Weaver was arrested in January of 1991. He was ordered to appear in court, but was given the wrong court date. A year passed, and the ATF transferred the case to the U.S. Marshals, who were then tasked with bringing Weaver in. The Marshals set up 24-hour surveillance on the Weavers' property on Ruby Ridge, tracking their every move and detailing their daily routines. On August 21, 1992, when the Marshals were scouting in the woods, the Weavers' dog started barking at them. Thinking a predator was near, the Weavers moved into the woods with firearms. At that point, a federal agent shot and killed the dog, and when the Weavers and their friend Kevin Harris heard the shots, they hurried in that direction. When Harris saw men in army fatigues and ghillie suits on the property, he opened fire, killing U.S. Marshal William Deegan. As Marshals returned fire, they killed Weaver's 14-year-old son, Samuel. In fact, they shot him in the back as he fled. Shortly after the first shots were fired, the FBI moved in. The next day, the grieving family moved their dead son's body to a shed in preparation for burial. As he was returning to the cabin, an FBI sniper shot Randy through the shoulder. Harris was also hit in the chest with a nearly fatal shot that just missed vital organs. Vicky, Randy's wife, stood at the door holding her infant daughter and propping the door open. In a scene of absolute horror, the same sniper who'd shot the men, Lon Horiuchi, shot Vicky in the head, killing her instantly and leaving their infant daughter covered in gore. These wouldn't be the last victims of the sniper either. Horiuchi would again fire his rifle in anger just a year later at the Waco massacre. Ruby Ridge would turn into a veritable war zone over the next week. The FBI used a megaphone to torment the family, demanding to speak with Vicky, whom they knew they killed and lay dead on the kitchen floor. Finally, on August 31st, the standoff was brought to an end with the family's surrender. Weaver was charged with murder, conspiracy, assault, and various other federal crimes, but in the end he was acquitted of all charges, all except an 18-month sentence which he served for failure to appear in court. His family was paid over $3 million in compensation for the killing of his wife and son, though what he lost and loved most dearly could never be repaid. In the aftermath of the slaughter, what came into focus was the gross overreach of the U.S. federal government, including the ATF. But the Bureau wasn't done just yet. The next year, in 1993, it planned a sudden daylight raid of David Koresh's Mount Carmel Center Ranch near Waco, Texas. The ATF claimed it suspected Koresh of stockpiling illegal weapons and thus issued a search warrant. Although the ATF later claimed the Branch Davidians opened fire first, one agent told an investigator immediately following the raid that the ATF fired first, killing a dog. Surviving members of the Davidians maintained that the ATF fired first. After the first exchange of gunfire, 4 ATF agents and 6 of Koresh's group were killed. After 51 more days, the FBI launched a CS tear gas attack with pyrotechnics. For years afterward in the press, and even before Congress, the FBI denied using pyrotechnics, but later admitted in 1999 that it had done so. The agency was caught lying so many times that it became a source of national disgrace. Among those who defended the actions were Chuck Schumer and Bill Clinton, who said, quote, "I do not think the United States government is responsible for the fact that a bunch of religious fanatics decided to kill themselves," end quote. Newly admitted U.S. Attorney General Janet Reno placed the blame for the entire situation on the Branch Davidians, the cult that owned and lived inside the Mount Carmel compound. In her opening statement of the investigation that followed the massacre, she said, quote, "Day after day, FBI negotiators tried to arrange a surrender. We faced an impossible situation, and they wouldn't leave," end quote. She used subtle language to deflect blame from the government and onto the leader of the Branch Davidians, David Koresh. Quote, "During the standoff," she said, "the environment in which Koresh forced the children present to remain continued to deteriorate." End quote. The government, in their opinion, had just eliminated a group of radical, child-abusing, law-breaking cultists. To them, a service to the American people. The U.S. government, instead of taking responsibility for its reckless actions, would blame the Davidians, a Seventh-day Adventist sect, for committing mass suicide, something that didn't fit with their actual theological beliefs, by the way. In order to protect them from mass suicide, so the government seemed to argue, it had to kill them. As the compound burned, the 76 Branch Davidians, including 26 children, were trapped inside and perished. What started the fire? Oh, those pyrotechnics that they didn't use. But another question arises. How did the ATF come into existence? In 1920, America ushered in prohibition, a nationwide ban on the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcoholic beverages under the 18th Amendment. This sweeping legislation was enforced by the Volstead Act, also known as the National Prohibition Act, which gave the amendment its legal teeth. Driven by the temperance movement, the legislation stormed through Congress, setting the stage for one of the most contentious eras in American history. Unfortunately for the government, prohibition was virtually impossible to enforce. The U.S. simply did not have the manpower to prevent alcohol use in America. As a result, bootleggers sprang up all across the country and began importing their liquor from across the Canadian and Mexican borders. Organized crime took off in America and brought mass violence with it. The gangs were better funded and more effective than the federal government ever had been, and the amount of alcohol in the U.S. quadrupled within months. To help manage this new and complex influx of work, the government created the Prohibition Unit under the command of the Bureau of Internal Revenue, what is now known as the IRS. 960 agents, known as dry agents, comprised the initial task force. In 1927, Congress passed a bill that elevated the unit to bureau status, and so it became the Bureau of Prohibition, operating under the oversight of the Department of Treasury and later the DOJ. In 1933, after just over a decade of some of the wildest years in American history, the government finally realized just how untenable prohibition enforcement actually was. Prohibition was officially repealed on December 5th, 1933, via the 21st Amendment. While the Prohibition era went away, the Bureau of Prohibition did not. Instead, it eventually morphed into what we now know as the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, or ATF. It has also since picked up explosives, so that now it is known as the BATFE. The ATF is yet another classic example of the nearly ironclad law of bureaucracy. When a government agency is created, it almost never goes away. In this episode of the King's Hall podcast, we talk with Isaac Botkin of T.REX Arms. He recently covered the history of the ATF and its involvement with Waco. Our very own Dan Burkholder sat down with Isaac to discuss the agency and its controversial history, how it became so enmeshed in turmoil in the 1990s, and what his thoughts about the future of the agency are. In the process, broader questions come into view. How did we get to a place of such significant government overreach? Why was the ATF allowed to act in such unchecked and obviously unjust ways? And how can we as Americans work to turn back the tide of statist tyranny? We'll discuss that and more in this episode of the King's Hall podcast. The King's Hall podcast exists to make self-ruled men who rule well and win the world.
Well, gentlemen, welcome to this episode of the King's Hall podcast. And I think if we say anything right from the start, it's probably hide your wives, hide your children, hide your dogs. The ATF is coming.
Hide the family pet.
Hide the pets.
Can we actually open with the meme that Eric found?
Yes, we literally have.
We need to put it up. It's one of the greatest memes of all time.
So you'll see this in the video, but ATF hand signals. Shoot that dog. I'll shoot that dog. come over here. There's a dog to shoot. And on it goes. But Dan.
This is the wrong house. Let's shoot the dog anyway.
Let's shoot the dog anyway. Dan, the family pets are not safe. Now, you got to talk to Isaac.
Yeah.
And there's this long history behind the ATF. But the dog thing, we're bringing it up. But why are we talking about the dogs?
ATF agents shoot dogs. There was one time where they actually did go into the wrong yard and they shot somebody's dog.
No.
Yes.
Yeah.
What?
Yeah. And then you saw with Waco and with Ruby Ridge, the
It was
first
in
thing they
both.
shoot is the dogs.
Why are they shooting
It's
the dogs?
always the dogs.
Who let the dogs out?
That song is not actually about the ATF or even canines.
Nope.
Or even
Don't ask us what it's about.
or
ask
even,
your parents.
Even canines. Brian, we have some exciting news too.
Yeah, we do.
Not about dogs.
Unrelated to dogs at all.
Pause up, don't shoot. But
Have you guys ever seen those Instagram reels where it's like day 67 of making unwatchable t-shirt designs? That's a perfect one.
like,
Pause up, don't shoot.
Pause up,
and it's-
don't shoot.
And it's a pit bull.
well, I mean,
Unbelievable.
some
That's a
dogs.
crossover.
Some dogs, I don't know. We do have some exciting news as of the time of recording. Our very own. I'm claiming him as our own because
Yeah.
he's on our network now.
Yeah.
But Andrew Isker went with CJ Engel. Of course, their show Contra Mundum, which is now on the NCP network. They got to sit down with a very special guest.
Yeah. The Tucker Carlson of Alp nicotine pouch fame.
Alp nicotine pouch fame.
Yeah.
Dan, why do you think this is such a big deal? I mean,
Well, Alp.
in all
it's-
seriousness.
I mean, Alp, it's great because you're not giving your money to Zinn anymore, which funds the Democratic Party.
Right.
I mean,
Yeah.
they donate a lot of money there. I don't think you were asking about nicotine.
No,
I just realized.
not as much. Not as much.
Not
No,
much that.
why is it a big deal?
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah,
just,
well, part of the big deal is you have this our space, and listeners know there's not a lot of like-minded people. This is a very small community that we're in. This dissident right, Christian right movement that we're in is very small. And so to get continual national platforms like this is a big deal because Isker and Mr. Engel, those guys are doing some great work in Tennessee with the community that they're starting, with their podcasts, with some of the investments and business moves and things like that. And so to get on a national platform on probably the biggest political show that exists right now is a pretty big deal, So I think it's obvious.
yeah, Brian, I'm curious. It's kind of interesting. The stuff that was, 5 years ago, fringe,
Yeah.
is now making inroads in kind of more mainstream conservative movement.
Yeah.
But how do you read it? I guess, what do you think is going on?
I think what you're seeing here is the rising tide of conservatism, particularly among young men, starting to actually break into the national sphere in conversation. Where for the last few decades, we've been dominated by longhouse, gynocentric conversation. The gatekeepers of the national political discourse, including on the conservative side, has mainly been longhouse type of gatekeeping, where men like Andrew Isker, if you had 5 years ago said, hey, by the way, Isker's going to be interviewed by Tucker Carlson, who's also going to have his own, he will have broken free of the shackles and be doing his own thing. And our guy, Andrew Isker, the 8th century wood chipper, this like semi-anon, he was never really super anon, but like semi-anon, edgy X account is going to be front loaded on this platform. And you'd see this happening multiple times. And I just think it's great news. Like the young men are becoming increasingly just wildly right-wing and conservative, many of them turning to Christ. And I think this is going to have overall just massively beneficial effects on our nation in the next generation.
Yeah. Well, it is interesting because you've had over the last 2 decades, particularly with, the Gospel Coalition, Tim Keller, this sort of movement, it was always the idea that you wanted to pander to the left, that you wanted to reach the people on the left, so you code the message that way. What's interesting now, I think, is that I don't think it's pandering, and I don't think it's particularly coding the message to people on the right, but I think just the authentic historic Christian faith actually has way more in common, Dan, with people on the right. Do you see that as a big opportunity?
Oh, absolutely. And the thing is, we know that if you just look at Conservative Inc., Eric and I were having a conversation just this morning about it, is that ultimately what Conservative Inc. does is they just tinker with the current political establishment. And so that's why you see it moving left. So, and pandering left.
Well, and we were
so
talking
frequently.
about like even the Daily Wire, which was supposed to be this like alternate media, ends up being controlled by fundamentally the same people, now bankrupt.
Mm-hmm. I would just like to know who those people are, Eric. Anyway, so yeah, they fundamentally just tinker with the political establishment, but there's no positive vision for the future. And what conservative Christians have or should have is a positive vision for the future. I think that's really what the dissident right or the new Christian right, they really just have established a positive vision for the future in Christian nationalism being described as just a Christian nation acting in its own good or for its own benefit.
Yeah, I think also the other part of it is you've seen like Gavin Newsom, like he's rebranding, right?
Man.
He goes on Charlie Kirk and he's trying to rebrand as a conservative. I think what's unique, Brian, about Stephen Wolf, about Andrew Isker, about what we're trying to do, even with a network, is we're not taking guys who are political chameleons who just see a moment to capture. It's that these are actually principled positions.
Yeah. Oh, 100%.
So I guess talk a little bit about the network, what we're doing there.
Yeah, well, so we've brought on Contra Mundum with CJ and Andrew Isker, CJ Engel and Andrew Isker. They're basically coming into our network where we're partnering with them and helping produce their show, as well as some other things behind the scenes, and really excited. Long term, we're expecting and hoping this to result in books and all sorts of other legacy type of media with CJ and Andrew. We're also helping produce one of the projects I'm most excited about with those guys, which is Appeal to Heaven. And it's a season-based, really well-executed video and podcast type of project where they're going through, in the first season, the Spanish Civil War. They're going to be talking in depth about what happened there, like
Franco.
over a dozen parts to this series that will be part of their supporter exclusive channel for a while at first, which if you guys want to support them directly, you can. I think it's contramundum.supercast.com. And if I'm wrong, maybe Martin can put the correct one here or something like that. So we're partnering with them, producing some legacy type content, and then also with the Lone Bulwark with Stephen Wolf and his show there, as well as, again, books and bringing him into the New Christendom Press network, and really just hoping to build coalition and momentum in making important contributions to this national conversation. And also, one of the things that we've said before that I'm really excited about when it comes to partnerships like this, and not just us, but lots of people have noted this, is that in the real project of seeing Christian nation established or Christian polity established, we really increasingly need specialists and elites and experts in all of these different spheres of the conversation. And historically, what's happened is that we've tended to collapse everything into the church. As the church as an institution has crumbled or weakened in its potency and liberalized and drifted, counter movements have, I think rightfully, typically come up through the ranks of the church and the pastorate. And so you'd have Christian pastors sort of wearing 15 different hats and speaking to everything all the time. Increasingly, and that's not necessarily bad, like we needed men like that. We needed that to happen. But increasingly, what we also need are genuine subject matter experts in areas. I think of like Stephen. He's a genuine expert in his field in Christian political theory. He's written the book of Note on the subject. He's not a pastor. He doesn't have the concerns of a pastor. He can speak to this narrow field very effectively and with a lot of force and also I can't find the word here, authority, because of his expertise. And so we're really hoping that this New Christendom Press network will bring in and help platform and build coalition with some genuine experts who are not pastors in their areas and help get their voices out there and expand the effectiveness of their message. So just very excited about those partnerships.
Yeah, I'm excited too. We'll be republishing the Boniface option in hardcover. So we've done Joe Garrisi with Honor Thy Fathers.
Spinning here.
We're going to do it in that kind of that same format with a hardcover, beautiful book. I'll be doing a forward, and then Andrew's doing a new afterward for the book. But we're excited to see that project happen as well, and forming these partnerships. Dan, as we kind of transition into the discussion on the ATF, you were the one obviously to talk with Isaac. We've connected with them in the past. I've had his brother on the Hard Men podcast to talk about what they're doing at T.REX. Really cool company, but also like really good Christian guy. And so Isaac did a series. I think it's on T.REX Talk.
T.REX Labs is the
T.REX
YouTube
Labs,
channel,
okay.
and it was on T.REX Talk, which is their podcast. So it's on both.
So he's kind of covered this issue. Really incredible, I think, theological, historical understanding. I watched some of that series, and he's kind of a savant. I mean, he's just pulling facts off the top of his book. You got to read this book. So it's really good for resourcing. If it would encourage people to look into that and check it out. But one of the things I think is really interesting is even the mainstream media has picked up that the right, starting in the 90s, the right was shaped by these events with Waco and Ruby Ridge. And usually the left media will say, oh, they're a bunch of paranoid schizophrenics on the right who are just concerned about government overreach. But then when you go through and you read the history of these events, I mean, we can start with Ruby Ridge. I mean, they shot his son in the back as he was running away, and then shot his wife in the head
while she was holding their infant.
Yeah, she wasn't holding an AR-15. She was holding a baby.
It's also interesting. Lon Harucci, so he ends up being at Ruby Ridge and Waco, the sniper. I think at Waco, he ends up like swapping the barrel on his gun, claiming to, they're like trying to destroy evidence. There's all this stuff that gets into. But he was charged with manslaughter for Ruby Ridge, and then the charges were just kind of disappeared. Do you think people on the right are they rightly concerned with government overreach based on these types of stories?
Well, yeah, absolutely. I mean, the more you dig into these cases, and I would recommend the T.REX Labs, series on this. There's a disposition with Janet Reno, and at Waco, they bring in tanks. And so when Janet Reno is asked about the tanks, she said, well, essentially they're like rental cars, is how she described them, as these tanks are taking down buildings around this compound and driving over vehicles and everything like that. And so one has to wonder, if there is no such thing as government overreach in these cases, why does one have to downgrade tanks as just mere rental cars? Well, I mean, the left is just trying to form a narrative to say like, oh, this was completely justified. Well, it's not a big deal. They're just pretty much like armored rental cars. It's not a big deal.
This was really the amping up of lawfare. You got the DOJ involved. You got Janet Reno. By the way, Martin can put a picture of this up because it's hilarious. But Saturday Night Live used to dunk on Janet Reno all the time, and they had Will Ferrell playing Janet Reno.
Yeah,
because she was mannish. But
dang, I haven't seen this.
Yeah, we'll get at least a screenshot of that up there. But it is interesting to me, the lawfare aspect. One of the cases she also oversaw was Matt Shepard. Became this pivotal like gay rights moment where he was allegedly killed by a bunch of rednecks in Laramie, Wyoming. There have been books on this. Turns out it wasn't that at all. He was killed by gay lovers who he had stolen drugs from them. And so there's like this gangland falling out, but it gets billed by the national media and the DOJ
as a hate crime.
A
homophobic hate crime. Yeah.
Because of that, we get all these new hate crime laws, and we're pushing LGBT stuff into the fore. So again, going back to that question, and maybe I'll ask it to Brian, what do you think about the weaponization of the DOJ to make war on U.S. citizens and to reframe, at least attempt, and they've been pretty successful, reframing American cultural life?
Yeah, I mean, this is one of those issues that we either win or our civilization dies. Like it's that kind of, you see it playing out even right now with judges in America blocking a lot of President Trump's activities or orders and that sort of thing. And basically, they're asking the executive branch to call their bluff. Like, will you defy our orders and assert the authority of the executive branch of the government to do branch of the government stuff, or will we have a complete, basically judiciocracy where the judges are in charge of everything? And like, by the way, a third of them or something like that are foreign born of our judiciary in America. I saw a statistic on X this week to that effect. This is one of those issues where they will turn these sorts of activities up slowly and slowly and slowly, and then you will realize that you have no freedom whatsoever, that you live in a bureaucracy that is essentially bent on stealing and killing and destroying anything that is good and true and beautiful. We just we cannot let this kind of stuff stand without challenging it and going toe-to-toe with it, which is why it's important that we don't forget stories like Waco and Ruby Ridge and forget like what they've actually done. It's why it's important that we don't forget what they did during the scamdemic. We have to remember and keep talking about these things because they will use all of the levers of their bureaucratic power to try and memory hole everything they did wrong. They will blatantly lie. The pyrotechnics are a great example of this. Basically, the pyrotechnic charges the FBI uses caught the place on fire that killed everybody. And so they tried to claim that it wasn't them forever. And they'll just, they'll go to Congress.
Well, they even tried to, lying under oath. They even tried to paint David Koresh. I mean, definitely some weird stuff. Like, we're not agreeing with them theologically.
No, and that's important to note that none of this has almost anything to do really with what the Branch Davidians were, what their beliefs were.
But I do think it is interesting that, like, I grew up, and Dan, you probably remember it as a kid too. I remember like watching the news while these things were happening, a little bit before Brian's time. But it is interesting, like they were painted as like absolute nut jobs. And then you go back and you read and you're like, okay, they're like a Seventh-day Adventist sect. They have some weirdities to them. But even the charge that they had planned this mass suicide, completely absurd. What was the group where they thought they were going to like?
Are you talking about Jim Jones?
Well, not Jim Jones. There was another one where they thought they were going to like ascend to a comet, so they all committed mass suicide.
Oh yeah.
We'll look that up. And
yeah, I can't remember.
So they tried to paint them as that, but like David Koresh was more of the almost like dispensational. Like they thought the apocalypse was coming, so we need to fortify, and that's why he had a FFL. And he had the firearms. He even welcomed the ATF in, like, hey, if you want to check the firearms, come and do it. And they were like, no, we think there's child abuse. CPS looks into it, and they're like, we don't find any evidence of that. He was well known in the town. People said he was a pretty affable guy.
Yeah, he would run like on the streets for exercise, and so they could have arrested him at any time, but they chose to wait until he was inside. And then
didn't they also have like they infiltrated the group with like federal agents who were pretending to try to join.
Yeah.
And pretty much within like 8 seconds, everybody knew like, oh, those are the feds. That's all right. You guys come in. Like they were really nice.
Come in, take a look around.
They didn't, they like pretty much knew who they were the entire time. And they were just like, but there's really nothing weird going on here. I guess you can come in. We basically assume at all times that there's at least one Fed in the congregation, just because this is the type of stuff that they do.
The suicide cult was Heaven's Gate.
Heaven's Gate, yeah.
That was 1997.
They thought they were going to go to the comet.
Yeah, so that was like a mass suicide, but that's not, kind of what this was. It's also interesting because Dan is on the government tyranny side. I think one of the things you guys end up talking about, I know at least Isaac has, is this idea that branches of the government end up having to justify their own existence. So they're actually looking for an event to say, look how great we did. It's obviously sad, tragic, and ironic that it ends up being like, look how like dysfunctional you are, actually. But this was actually true of the U.S. Forest Service in firefighting. A lot of people have pointed to the fact that they were sort of like elated when the big burn happened in Idaho because they were like, oh, fires. Like people care about that at a national level. It can justify our existence. And then fast forward to now, they're like, why doesn't the Forest Service like allow timbering in areas where there's lots of downed trees, and like why are we allowing the big burns to happen in the first place? So there becomes a question of, are they just trying to justify their own existence?
Yeah, I think that's a valid question. Actually, in Utah, in the Uintas, the pine borer has decimated a majority of the pine trees. It's like ripe for burning, and it spreads all over the U.S. And they could stop that at any time through controlled burns or logging or something like that, but they've let it perpetuate. And I did ask Isaac, and I'll let you listen to the interview, why Waco? We talked about Waco in particular because Isaac actually was there as a young boy. His father was made documentaries. Wow. And so he went with his father.
At Waco?
Yes, at Waco right after it happened.
Wow.
And so he shares some of his personal experience, and I do ask him the question, why Waco? Why? Because Janet Reno came into office when it was in the middle of this siege. Why didn't she stop it? Why did she let it go? She could have blamed it on her predecessor and had scored political points. And so he has some very interesting answers to that. Part of it is, like you said, Eric, is just justifying their existence. But you have to hear his answer. Yeah, very sharp guy. Really, really great guy, Isaac. He's great.
Yeah, he is. Last thing I want to ask about. We'll be at Right Response as of recording. That's next week. I think they'll actually hear this after. One of the things I'll be talking about is the Longhouse, and this society created under feminist rules, basically, to give you the TLDR. But reading about prohibition in preparation, is that not like the epitome of the Longhouse?
Speaking of the Longhouse.
So Brian, just fill us in. Like, why would it be problematic?
Prohibition is basically largely like women are responsible for prohibition. Men are too, but prohibition was very much a Longhouse movement. The temperance movement was like a feminist. It was, and you can see the selling point of like, oh, men are drunks and they're beating their wives, and like men do evil things with alcohol, men and women, but men do evil things with alcohol. So there would be whole campaigns of like lips that touch liquor will not touch ours kind of thing. It was the early like school marming. You can literally see these pictures of women holding these signs in the 20s and earlier.
It's kind of weird too, because it was the same era when we got rid of head coverings.
Yeah, basically you have feminism come in, the first wave feminism come in, and what do they immediately start doing? Well, they start basically trying to pass micromanaging nanny state laws that the government has no business passing to try and fix their personal household problems. This is what women do, like when they get in charge of the government. They weaponize the government to attempt to basically disempower men in all of the spheres where God has appointed that a man ought to be the head. So in the home and the state and the church, they get in, and that's immediately, you see this in all sorts of government bureaucratic meddling, is that it's functionally longhoused. Basically, you can say thank you to feminism for prohibition, the massive increase in government that arose from it, giving us the ATF, and all the organized crime that created super rich and super powerful organized crime networks. Similar things happen today and continue with the war between bureaucracy and organized crime. But basically, there you go. Thank you, feminism.
Yeah, it's interesting, too, because it's something, and we'll close with this, but something that we'll be talking about with the conference, which is safety third. One of the things the feminist Longhouse did, Dan, was really push like safety first in every area of life. And you can think of all the ways that backfired, prohibition being one of them, but the nanny state being another one. So I guess if you would just talk about the conference, why safety third, kind of the ethos for what we're trying to accomplish. We see this as an age of opportunity, but not if we're going to keep being nanny state school marms.
Yeah, Brian really says it best when he says it's really recovering the American will. Because if you look at American history and some of the greatest things that our people have done, like the Empire State Building, wasn't it built in less than a year?
Oh, interesting.
And the Golden Gate Bridge and like all of these projects,
Verrazano Narrows, like all this,
all of them happened so quickly.
Hoover Dam,
and yeah, the Hoover Dam, like just having this desire and this will to actually build, and it's been something that we've lost. Actually, Speaking of Andrew Isker, I think he just shared a post recently. He's like, why is it that you go into rural, like small town Midwest America, and the downtowns you could see that they were beautiful at one time. They were made of brick and of stone. There's always like a beautiful courthouse and beautiful church and these great buildings. You can see that here in Ogden as well, in the downtown. You can just see the remnants of what was once probably a very beautiful downtown area. But we decided that we're going to build the safe option, which is going to be low risk. It's going to be buildings that last essentially as long as a mortgage lasts, and then you just tear it down and rebuild. That's not aspiring to greatness. That's actually just living in a very safe and ugly world. And so we really do want men to do great things and to build a great, country for their children, for their generations, to do things that will actually transcend their own lives and that could be passed on to the generations so that they have a better life than we did.
Yeah, that's awesome. Definitely encourage people to check that out, newchristendompress.com/I think 2025.
2025, yep.
You can sign up for the conference today. We've got all sorts of events for Business Mixer, VIP Mixer. We've got a pastor's breakfast. Certainly, if you're a pastor, we want to see you there. We want to encourage a lot of guys in the good work that is there to be done. But Brian, also concert.
Yeah.
Somebody that I know is doing a concert. I believe you'll be serenading me there with some songs to Winnie.
You personally. I'm actually planning on putting you on a stool in the middle, and then I just sit in front of you and I make really aggressive eye contact and I sing songs to Eric. So if you guys also want to be there, present for this, you can.
You can be there.
But that's mainly what it will be and what it's going to look like from what I understand from our planning meetings. Eric asked for this. This wasn't my idea. That's what he asked for. So
history's a little murky on that one, but it's going to be a good time.
It's just going to be so much fun. The singles mixer, like, we're going to be hanging out a lot. We got the new Christendom games happening on Saturday after the final closing of the official conference. Join us for Sunday. We'll have a barbecue in the park afterward. Really just great time to meet people, find who you're going to marry, who you're going to build businesses with. That genuinely, that's what happens at these conferences. It's really just a highlight of the year. It's so much work on our end that every year, like by the day it starts, we're like, why did we do this? But then when in the thick of it, you go, this is why. It's worth the effort. It's worth the work. It's worth all of the man hours and mad scrambling because, genuinely, this is where people meet who they're going to start businesses and get married to and, do all these important things. And if we're going to build Christendom, if we're going to build America, Christian nation and make Christian boroughs, we need this kind of coalition and friendship. It can't just be purely digital. It has to be in the flesh as well. So definitely grab some tickets. Come. If you're a pastor and you want to come, reach out to us. If you want to bring your team, we have all sorts of pastor discounts and incentives and things like that. Also, if money is an issue for you on the ticket price, do reach out to us and we'll make it work for you. We want everybody who wants to be there to be able to come. Obviously, it costs us an enormous amount of money to put these things on, but we want people to be there that are going to benefit from it. So
it's really important.
Where should they reach out if they have a question like that? I can't remember.
You can just
email.
Reach out info@newchristendom.
That's what it is. Info@newchristendompress.com is the email address.
Info@newchristendompress.com. Reach out to us. Again, if you're a pastor or financial hardship, whatever, we just want to, if you want to be there, we want to help you be there. It was cool on Sunday because I was in the back. We were getting ready to do communion, and so prepping for that. And in front of me was a couple that is pregnant, and they met at last year's singles mixer.
Oh,
married.
That's awesome.
We got to be a part of that. So just an encouragement to people. I know a lot of the single people that we talk to in our church, it can be discouraging, but it's also just a time to encourage them in the good work that God has set before them. One final thing, Brian, you've been prepping. Mm-hmm. I'm pretty sure you're going to dominate the games, but people have asked us, were you kidding about the new Christendom Press games?
No, this is not a joke.
This is not a joke. So if you're hearing this, you're like, are there actually new Christendom games at the new Christendom conference? Is Tate Taylor actually facilitating this? The answer to that question is yes.
Yes. I believe when this episode comes out, the qualifiers will be open. And the way that it's going to work is that there's an online qualifier where you perform a workout. You have to film it, I think, and send it in. There'll be some logistics there. We'll try to put the link in the description if it's live by the time this episode comes out for the game qualifier. There's a huge strength aspect to it, and then there's an endurance aspect to the qualifier. And I think they're going to take the top 30 applicants and then invite them to participate here in Ogden at the games on the Saturday, right after the official conference stuff closes. There'll be some games. And then you can there's going to be prizes. You can prove that you are the strongest and, basically the best all-around athlete in the new Christendom.
I mean, they'll have to beat Dan to win the title, but
I am genuinely going to try to qualify, though I do not know if I have. I've done the qualifier workout twice.
I felt really good about it. And then there were guys doing videos on X.
Yeah.
And the one dude was like, here's my 4-rep max on like 650-pound deadlift. And I was like, Brian is definitely going to beat that guy.
Yeah, and Eric was like, wow, that guy sucks.
People keep asking me, they're like, are you participating? I'm like, okay, this is like Old Testament times. We are sending a champion.
Yeah.
His name is Tate.
His name's Tate Taylor.
He runs 100 miles
at a time.
At a time.
On his feet, not in a vehicle, not on a bicycle, on his dogs. Dude, look out. ATF might shoot him right out from under you.
You say dog, they get excited.
They're like, whoa. No, I was using a metaphor. His feet. His dogs are barking, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, so be sure to look for that. New Christendom Games. That is real.
It's going to be great.
It's 100% real. We'll jump now, gentlemen, into the episode. Dan, thank you again for talking with Isaac.
Yeah, absolutely. And just as a note, I stopped recording with Isaac, and he said, "Oh, we're done," because I had some questions for you. And so I said, "Oh, let's just record an after hours episode." So Isaac and I really had more of an informal conversation that I thought was really good to get some more insight.
Yeah, so that'll be on the
T.REX is doing.
Patreon channel.
And so we had a conversation that I thought was really good. So hold on. If you're a patron, you can listen to that. If you're not a patron, you can sign up.
Yeah, by the way, thanks for bringing that up. Patreon access to episodes that are not live for anybody else. So right now, my son did a 2-part series on Charlemagne. That is magnificent. That's up. Super encouraging, super inspiring. The man who built what we know as Christian Europe. So Charlemagne's up there. We've got an interview with David Edgington about reviling wives with Pastor Kevin Griffin. How do you deal with a reviling wife? That's all exclusive to Patreon. So tons of content for people to check out. So definitely encourage them to do that. Check the link in the show notes. You can sign up for Patreon. We'll jump now into the episode.
Well, welcome to this episode of the King's Hall. My name is Dan Burkholder, and I am joined with Isaac Botkin. He is one of the guys at T.REX Arms. He's also the host of the T.REX Labs YouTube channel and host of the T.REX Talks podcast, which are all really high-quality content. I would encourage you to go listen there. You're also a published author. Is that correct?
That is technically correct. Can you, if your book is out of print, are you still published? Is it once published, always published?
I think
How does
once
this work?
published, always published. It was on filmmaking,
Okay.
correct? I did some research on you before this.
It was on filmmaking. Half of the book holds up really well, and the other half that predicted what was going to happen with internet filmmaking, pretty far off the mark.
Well, a published author nonetheless. And you are also a jack of all trades kind of guy. Just judging by the T.REX Labs YouTube channel, you talk about things like communication and drones and new weapon tech and old weapon tech. You just released a not controversial at all video on the 9mm and the 5.7 and how those interact with one another, and possibly the 5.7 replacing the 9mm, which...
We'll see.
I'm a 9mm guy. I mean, I won't die on that hill, but, well, hopefully, anyway, on 9mm.
Hopefully not, yeah.
But so you have a lot of range, a lot of interests. And so I've really enjoyed your content. The drone and communication stuff is really interesting. The long-range intel video that you produced was really good. And so,
Thank you.
jack of all trades kind of guy.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. In this episode, I really was captivated by a series that you did on T.REX Labs. So tell me a little bit about T.REX Arms, because we're going to be talking about the ATF, some interesting topics like Waco, and potentially the future of the ATF. And T.REX Arms is obviously in the firearms industry and has some dealings with the ATF. And I'm excited to hear about that.
Well, the company is, I think, 11 years old now, just over 11 years old. And it started off like a lot of companies, parents' garage stuff, making Kydex holsters with bandsaws and drill presses, just really super basic. Started selling holsters on eBay. All this was my younger brother, Lucas, who, if you look at our media, you will generally see Lucas running firearm drills, just shooting at a super high level, incredibly fast. So he has done a lot of the media, a lot of the education, but he is the guy who started making the holsters in the first place. And as the business grew, we kind of had our biggest spike of growth in 2020. The Lord really, I think, providentially put a lot of different things on our hearts. And so as we expanded from holsters into sewn nylon stuff and carrying body armor and a bunch of other retail things, we were relatively well prepared for stuff that happened in 2020. Like, we'd been pushing body armor as something that civilians should consider owning. And we had a good body armor source, and we had good ceramic plates that we wanted people to buy. And nobody was super interested in body armor until riot season of 2020. And then everyone sort of went like, oh yeah, I guess that's what body armor is for. And a bunch of people bought body armor. We had significant growth. We were able to hire a bunch of folks in our county, a number of whom, if you recall 2020, it's now, fifth anniversary of a thing that a bunch of people are pretending didn't happen. But Hickman County's in Middle Tennessee. It's pretty socioeconomically depressed area, but we knew a lot of folks that were looking for jobs in 2020 as stuff had shut down in Nashville and around the area. And we got to hire a bunch of folks at a really key pivotal time, I think, in their lives. And so, yeah, our focus has been on community preparedness, both in the products that we sell to our customers, but then also in trying to be a manufacturing facility here in Middle Tennessee that is a good employer. So if you go to our website, it's all the stuff that I just mentioned: holsters, body armor, plate carriers, but also all kinds of weapon accessories all the way up to night vision. So our goal is to educate people on that stuff, make sure that we're a good supplier for it, have good customer service. But even that community piece of just what we're trying to build as a business here has driven us, helped us make a lot of decisions. And that's kind of been, I think, providentially a great goal for us, because it's helped us be set up for stuff that we couldn't possibly have predicted or in our own wisdom been ready for in the past.
Yeah, that's great. I'm actually wearing a T.REX holster as we speak, which has a 9mm in it. So,
okay, great.
Yeah. So love your products. They're great. They're great products. I'm just curious, who's the better shooter, you or Lucas?
Oh, it's Lucas. There's no question. There's no question. Amongst the brothers, it is Lucas, and there's no contest. However, there are some recent hires to the business who are very good. We got a guy working in the holster department, holster development side, named Brantley, and he is very highly ranked competition shooter. And then we also have a Marine named Brandon, who's in a bunch of our content. Brandon will give you a run for money on any weapons platform, and Brandon he's phenomenal at a bunch of different stuff. I think he's 9th ranked in the tactical games nationwide, and then Brantley will just crush everybody with pistol. No question.
That's incredible. So, yeah. I mean,
we have some high performers here.
My wheelhouse is more like a shotgun in the duck blind. That's kind of that's more my speed.
It's good stuff.
Actually, I do have some training here this afternoon, but anyway, that's beside the point. So you guys are in the firearms industry, and
we are.
If you've watched any of the T.REX videos, listeners, you have seen Lucas and actually a lot of the new hires as well that you were talking about, going through some of the shooting drills and reviewing firearms and things like that. You have a lot of really cool guns that probably attract the attention of the ATF. I imagine you guys have an FFL and things like that would require you to interact with the ATF. And so, is that true?
Yeah, that is true. We have an FFL, Federal Firearms License. And we are an SOT, we're a manufacturer, so we can make interesting, fun, cool stuff. And some of this is very, very important to the business because part of our business is making cool YouTube videos with cool guns. The other part is also integral to our business. As a holster manufacturer, as we develop relationships with firearm companies, occasionally, not as often as I might like, but occasionally we get prototype handguns and lights so we can start building holsters for things that are not quite on the market. So obviously people don't want to send prototypes through our local pawn shop, FFL. So we kind of have to have our own for security purposes. They don't like to just mail prototypes out, everywhere. So yeah, we have an FFL and we get pretty regular ATF audits, which is not abnormal, but we have them a little more regularly than some FFLs do.
Yeah, and we have been using the acronym ATF. I imagine most of our listeners will know what that is. But for those that don't know, it's the Department of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, which was
and explosives.
And explosives? Yeah. Well, I was going to say that was
explosives added years ago, yeah.
My college house was known as the Department of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. But anyway, that's the dad joke. I'm a dad, have to make that joke.
It's a great corner store, yeah.
And so you would think, just from the outsider perspective, if you don't know a lot about the ATF, you would think, well, yeah, it kind of makes sense. You don't want to have some, hillbilly in the hollers brewing some sort of corn mash whiskey that's going to make people go blind. And yeah, you should probably keep the, firearms out of the hands of murderers and things like that. Is that actually what they do? What does the ATF do?
So on occasion, they do stuff like that. There have been ATF agents known to roll up into a random Tennessee holler or two. There have been some busts of cigarette smugglers in New York.
Those
people remember that dimly.
Those terrible cigarette smugglers.
Yeah, but firearms is the main thing. It's where most of the focus of the ATF goes. This is pretty widely discussed, very, very publicly by guys in the ATF. It's obviously observed by people who watch the ATF. The focus is on firearm. I'm trying to decide exactly how to characterize this because their goal is, of course, safety and regulatory obedience. So there's kind of two tracks of the ATF. There's keeping a very close eye on people with federal firearms licenses to make sure they're following all the rules and filling out all the paperwork. And one of the Biden administration's directives to the ATF was I forget the official term, but it's basically a zero tolerance policy. So any mistakes on the paperwork will get your federal firearms license revoked so that you can no longer transfer firearms. So there were record numbers of revocations of FFLs over the last 4 years, far more than there's ever been in the past, just because of this really much higher zero tolerance policy. And then the other side of it is going after people who have already committed crimes, because filling out your paperwork not wrong is not a crime necessarily. It's just a reason that you can't have a license anymore. But they go after people who have theoretically committed crimes by violating the other rules that the ATF has. And the ATF, this is an issue across the entire federal government, the entire executive department. We have our legislative system. We have our legislative branch that makes laws. And then we have on the executive side, we have, say, the Department of Justice. And their job is to enforce those laws. And the judicial branch rules on those cases. This is the great separation of powers that we have here. But in the executive branch, there's a lot of agencies, most agencies, I would say, have taken upon themselves to add rules and regulations on top of the legislator's intent, like in a Pharisaical sort of way. So the ATF has done a whole bunch of things, even just recently, even in the last few years, where machine guns are not permitted under the 1934 National Firearms Act. So for 90 years, machine guns have been illegal without specific paperwork and a tax stamp and all that sort of thing. But the ATF just constantly broadens the definition of what a machine gun is. So they will just change the rules on what a machine gun is. They will change the rules on what a short barrel rifle is. So very recently, they changed the definition of a pistol brace. into a stock, even though we have like 10 years of pistol braces being sold, somewhere between 10 million and 40 million pistol braces in the wild. So just millions of Americans own these things. The ATF, just with a stroke of a pen, not being a legislative body themselves, just decides that these are now shoulder braces, and anything they're attached to is a short-barreled rifle, and anyone that possesses one has just committed a felony with a minimum 10-year sentence. So that kind of regulatory overreach and oversight is not limited to the ATF, but the ATF is a great place to kind of see it in action because it is about basic mechanical stuff where they're just, they have no lawmaking capability, but their definitions and their redefinitions of basic mechanical parts is kind of interesting to see.
Yeah, they have enough regulations that they make sure that, if possible, they can make everyone a criminal. With the pistol braces,
yeah,
a great example of that recently.
And it goes further. If you have the right kind of oil filter on your property or the wrong kind of oil filter on your property, that could be an illegal suppressor for a firearm. So there was a very recent case, I think it was just a couple years ago, they went after an active air marshal, a federal air marshal, and he had an organic farm and he had some fuel filters and he had some hose attachments, stuff that you would probably be using on an organic farm in a very innocent way. And they determined that since these could be used as sound suppressors or silencers officially on a firearm, and he didn't have the paperwork for that, he got busted on that. So he lost his security clearance. He lost his job. He did get jail time, but it wasn't the maximum. So I haven't figured out exactly all the details of the case. But yeah, just the possession of an item that has this potential use was sufficient for them to generate a case and go after this guy.
I don't even know what to say about that. That's insane.
Right.
So just because I understand, oil filters, I may have seen them used for that purpose, but just because the diameter and the thread pitch could fit on the barrel of a firearm to be used, but there was no evidence that he actually had done that.
There's no evidence that he's done that. And even reading through the case documents, I don't think he even had any of the appropriate adapters. So it's I agree with you. It's interesting if you have specific adapters for other items that you own. That does make me kind of like, yeah. But apparently this guy just had the filters themselves. No adapters were mentioned whatsoever. And I would call it a travesty of justice unless, to give the ATF the benefit of the doubt, which I never actually do, like maybe something very weird and secret that didn't come out in the case, maybe kind of, sort of, but I also believe that sort of thing should come out publicly in the cases. As it reads, as far as the public can tell, there is absolutely no reason for this guy to be indicted for this crime, let alone prosecuted.
Yeah, that's insane. So I know you said right now in our current regulatory environment, the ATF is primarily focused on firearms, but that wasn't the origins of the ATF, correct?
Correct. So the ATF has bounced back and forth between reporting to the Department of Justice or the IRS, the Department of the Treasury, because back in the 20s, or I guess it was right before the 20s, we had prohibition in the states, and what happened was we went from the management of liquor in this country being a massive tax revenue generating thing to just outlawing it completely. The Volstead Act banned the manufacture, possession, consumption of alcohol. And so all of those agents who had been going around just collecting taxes now became enforcement agents. And if you remember how prohibition went, all of a sudden there's tons of bootleggers because people wanted to keep drinking alcohol. People wanted to keep making alcohol because it was a really good business. So now the United States government, the Treasury Department, needs a whole bunch of enforcement officers. They're no longer collecting revenue. They're chasing bootleggers around in the hollers of Tennessee and trying to bust into warehouses and infiltrate smuggling gangs, and everything that you remember from prohibition kind of eventually leads to the ATF, because after years, the government and the people make it very clear to the government they don't want prohibition. It is a failure in every possible sense of the word. And it is revoked, and there's a new constitutional amendment that says you can't ban alcohol anymore. But the government still has all these enforcement agents sitting around, and they still have the responsibility to oversee some of this stuff. And shortly after Prohibition, you also had, Prohibition built a very large organized crime wave, organized crime organizations, but also kind of a crime wave in the United States. So you have bank robbers and gangsters and murders and things like that. So the government has something ostensibly for these enforcement officers to go and do, and they pass the National Firearms Act in 1934 after the Valentine's Day Massacre and other kind of horrific gangster crimes. And that is what bans machine guns and short-barreled rifles and suppressors and things like that. So part of it was a problem looking for a solution in a way, where we have all these agents now and they need something to do. And part of it was people in the United States were legitimately horrified by the kind of criminal activity that they were seeing. In hindsight, it was almost nothing. Like, compared to what happens in Chicago today, some of those gangster wars are just barely worth batting an eye out. But at the time, people were very concerned that this was a huge crime wave. And so they allowed the government to go ahead and begin hunting down and confiscating machine guns and other scary new firearm types.
Yeah, the history of the Prohibition that you shared on T.REX Labs was fascinating, really interesting to me. A lot of it unknown. Actually, in Ogden, Utah, where we are right now, where I am right now, there's a series of tunnels under the city because Ogden is a famous railroad town. And so they would smuggle in alcohol through these tunnels. And we've all heard of speakeasies. I mean, that's kind of like a vogue thing. I went to a Seattle bar, and it was a speakeasy. You needed to know the password and all that. But that's where kind of the origins of that come from. But we're not here to talk about booze as much as I would like to talk about a good scotch. Are you a scotch bourbon guy? Like, what do you...
Just a little bit. I'm more of a beer guy myself, but I appreciate a decent whiskey. So technically I should know more about this, because Hickman County was known as Keg County back in the day. We had so many springs and so many hollers. A massive amount of moonshine stills were operating all around us here at that time.
I mean, I think a different conversation for a different day. Back to the firearms, though. With the history of the ATF, this example that you gave of the gentleman with the wrong oil filters on his property is not something that's out of character. That's not something that's out of the blue for the ATF to actually manufacture some sort of case and to bring the hammer of justice at just an insane level towards people that may be innocent, completely innocent. And your series on T.REX Labs focused on Waco. And I didn't know a lot about Waco. I didn't know a lot about Ruby Ridge. So those were very, very helpful. But Waco was particularly interesting to me with so it was the Branch Davidians, which was I understand it was a group of people that lived in a compound or in a building, a series of buildings on some property. Yeah. And
some people lived in the compound. Some people lived nearby. Yeah. So this all happens in the 90s. So the reason we wanted to do this series on the ATF is the timing is the main reason, kind of twofold. Number one, we had a new administration coming into office, talking about massive overhauls of the executive department, and thought, this would be a good time to talk about some ATF stuff. But the other thing is that all of this happened in the early 90s, which I was very young at the time. And now amongst T.REX Arms folks, I'm actually quite old. So there's a whole generation of new gun owners and firearm aficionados who do not remember that time. And it wasn't very well reported on at the time. Remember, the 90s is a time where not only is there no internet, but there's barely cable television. There's barely any way for you to get anything other than mainstream news. There's almost no alternative news available. So the stuff that happened at Waco is stuff that even at the time was very hard to get any backstory about it, as opposed to just that mainstream narrative. So we have this group, and I should have boned up on my notes a little bit before this conversation, but I believe that they're a sort of an offshoot of Seventh-day Adventists, and I could
No, that's
be wrong about that.
correct.
But they're a little weird. As we would consider as Christians, we would consider them to have some abnormal positions that are a deviation from Scripture. But we would not consider them to be the kind of heretics that need to be burned to death by the FBI. Like, that's not the level of heresy, nor is the FBI or the ATF the department that really should handle that sort of thing, if the magistrate handles that sort of thing at all. So the situation is really interesting. The ATF builds a narrative about these weird Christians. And the same thing happened with the Ruby Ridge massacre with Randy Weaver. The media kind of built a sort of a fear of Christians into a lot of movies and television shows at the time. Weird outsiders. Homeschooling was still new. Homeschooling was still scary. So these people who go off and they live by themselves are scary, and they're a threat. So that is kind of the narrative that Randy Weaver got pulled into, and the ATF and the Marshal Service surrounded and basically put his home under siege and killed a number of his family members. He survived, but there were more people who were killed in the Waco siege. So we have this small religious group that definitely has, I would say, some unbiblical beliefs, but they live in a compound in Waco, Texas, and they have business activities that are not too different from T.REX. They sell guns at gun shows, which we don't do, but they also make firearm accessories. They sew magazine carriers and chest rigs. Like, they do basic business activities that are completely fine. They have an FFL license. They are registered with the ATF. They have paperwork with the ATF. The ATF knows roughly what they own and are supposed to own. And the ATF is seeing what they're putting on the tables at these different gun shows at the time. So they're not as secretive or mysterious as the media kind of paints them to be at this time. And the media mostly focuses on other allegations of child abuse and stuff like this. So they're investigated by Child Protective Services of Texas. They're actually investigated by the FBI, and those cases are kind of dropped. But then the ATF really needs a win. They need a big splashy win. And what is happening is, I don't know how much context to give, how well people remember this, but
why did they need a win? Were they getting bad publicity? Were they being seen as like a do nothing sort of department? Did they need more funding?
It was a number of things. So this is very hard. This will be hard for your listeners to believe, but Bill Clinton had just been elected. He hadn't been inaugurated as all this stuff was kicking out. I think he's just been inaugurated. Bill Clinton had just been elected. And despite being the kind of the Democrat that Bill Clinton was, he actually campaigned on a clean up government and get rid of waste. And it's actually kind of
that's
surprising.
not really
that used to be
Obama
a Democratic platform.
Thing. I mean, yeah.
Sure. Yeah.
Whether
he was
they
going to
actually
secure
do
the
it or not.
borders and right.
Right.
There were a bunch of positions that he took where the ATF was a little bit worried about their funding. They were kind of a do nothing organization. They had grown their budget and not so many of their outcomes. And they had just had this pretty disastrous Ruby Ridge siege where they brought a case against this guy, Randy Weaver. They shot his son. They shot his wife. He had all the charges dropped against him. Like, it's a very bad looking case. And so they really wanted to win. So they created a case against the Branch Davidians sort of in general, but against David Koresh, their leader specifically. And the allegations were things that could have been really easily checked out without a major raid. In fact, they even sent undercover guys into the compound to look at stuff. So everybody in Waco, Texas knew these guys. They knew that David Koresh would go jogging. He actually had a Christian rock band and toured with the rock band. So arresting him would have been a very easy thing to do elsewhere. Looking at what is inside the compound would have been easy because they have an FFL and they've been sending undercover guys in there. But they set up a pretty significant raid with just a number of agents driving in vans. And they call the press ahead of time so that the press can see what's happening. Well, because Waco is kind of a small town at the time, the postman finds out that this is happening and calls one of his relatives who was inside the compound. So their element of surprise is gone. Everyone knows that the raid is blown, but they've called in the press. So it happens anyway. And then it's kind of unclear who begins shooting first because there's not very many surviving records. But you can see ATF agents assaulting the building. You can see them leaving a building, coming out of the windows. And that begins a siege that lasts for days and days and days. And the siege ends when the building catches on fire. And there have been negotiations. There have been conversations between David Koresh and the Branch Davidians and the FBI and the ATF for days and days and days. But they've cut off all the communication with the outside world. They've sent the press far away. So all we have are the recordings that have been released, which are not complete, and the Branch Davidians have released some of the children, like they've let some of the people who want to leave the compound. But ultimately, everything ends with the compound burning to the ground. And I think there's 2 survivors that make it out after it catches on fire. But dozens of women and children are killed in this fire. And this is kind of only the beginning. It's in some ways, as bad as this is, the way that the investigation is handled, the way that the hearings are handled, the way that the evidence disappears later, these things are in many ways even more troubling than the way then that the siege itself was handled. And instead of, this incredibly botched raid and this incredibly horrific siege being a point of contention where the new president, Bill Clinton, and his new attorney general, Janet Reno, follow up on some of their campaign promises to look into problematic behavior, fire a bunch of people that George Bush hired. That would have been like a thing that they could have done. They just, Janet Reno especially, they just really cover for the ATF and cover for the FBI and just really stand up for them and say, they did a great job and we're going to protect their jobs and their budget and so forth. So the fallout from that was really minimal for the people that were involved. And because the mainstream media was just a few TV channels and a few big newspapers, there wasn't very much conversation to the contrary, unless you were a part of bizarre alternative circles. Like if you went to gun shows and you subscribed to Soldier of Fortune magazine or those I don't know if you remember these, but like typewritten newsletters that were photocopied and mailed to your house. Like those were kind of our alternative sources of information back in the day. So unless you were connected to those somehow, you probably just saw Dan Rather and the other folks of the day talking about, oh, this horrible tragedy. Religious extremists have suicide pacted themselves and burned all their children, and the heroic agents are, some of them were hurt too. So now on to the weather. Like that was a lot of the coverage.
Well, and you know, from your summary, one could be tempted to believe like, oh, maybe they were crazy. It sounds reasonable. Like the FBI, the ATF, they surrounded it, and maybe the Branch Davidians did shoot first, and then they just retaliated, and there was an escalation over time. But it wasn't just that simple, was it? There were other things that they were doing, such as the terror tactics that they were using, right? So they were playing music. And
it's fascinating stuff that kind of boggles the mind. Like, I'm pretty sure you're not allowed to do this in other countries. Like, I'm pretty sure you're not allowed to do this, weren't allowed to do this. The rules of engagement would not have permitted this in Afghanistan. But just during the siege, like turning the power on and off, like blasting super high power searchlights into the windows at night so nobody could sleep, playing incredibly loud music, playing the sounds of animals being tortured. One wonders where the FBI got sounds of animals being tortured. But this is the kind of thing that is being done against not just American citizens, but there are many children in this compound. And their arrest warrant is for David Koresh and only David Koresh. So the fact that this just continued for weeks and weeks, and they just kind of ratcheted up the tension constantly, And all the while just like keeping the press at bay, just keeping the press. It was 3 miles away because the ATF were supposedly in possession of a 50 caliber rifle, which has a deadly range of 3 miles. So the press has to be 3 miles away. Meanwhile, ATF agents are walking around with no body armor and helicopters are flying overhead. So a lot of the story just doesn't line up. And in many ways, I would say that we're better off today. Not only do we have alternative channels for information like podcasts, but Americans are actually more educated on how firearms work. A 50 caliber rifle is not as scary, I think, now as it was in the 90s. People have a better understanding of this stuff. People have a better understanding of ballistics. People are probably more likely to question, well, if they have deadly anti-tank weapons inside of their compound, why are you just driving tanks around, crunching up their cars? Like, why are they not shooting your tanks already?
Yeah, that was something else I wanted to bring up was they brought in tanks. We're talking about like families living together and had committed no crimes that we're aware of. Were they ever convicted of any crimes at this point?
So here's what happened later on. There were a number of survivors who left the building before the fire, and then there were a couple of people who got out after the fire started, managed to escape from the building. There were some people who were arrested because they had jobs inside of Waco, Texas. They were not there when the raid happened, and they were arrested when they tried to come back to see what was going on. Those folks were all put on trial. They had different charges attached to them. And the judge kind of treated them all the same as people who had conspired to kill federal officers, because I believe that there were people inside of the building shooting back. I think that is extremely likely. I also am curious about all the bullets that were removed from the injured ATF agents. Like, what were those bullets? Because there was some incompetence that you can see in the videos too amongst the agents who were on the roof and going in and out of that window. I think there may have been potentially some other issues there, but I would say that if you are being attacked by people in that way, it is very possible that we should discuss self-defense. But that was one of the first things that the federal judge took off the table. He told the jury, you cannot consider self-defense in this trial at all. You can only consider these very specific limited set of facts, and we will not admit other types of evidence. So even that conversation with the federal judge was very, very limited to very specific things. He overruled some of the things that the defense, the prosecutor, and even the prosecutor's evidence, he kind of overruled some of that stuff too. So just everything about it just feels very, very dirty. And
well, and then there's the fire.
Flavors of injustice everywhere.
Yeah, the fire, though, also, there's a lot of speculation around the fire because it was very devastating. You know, it killed a lot of people. It was
fast.
And it was very fast. And there's some debate as to how the fire started. Right.
So the ATF and the FBI talked about the different types of tear gas, CS gas, that they were using at the time. And for a long time, they were very adamant that they'd been using non-pyrotechnic grenades. They'd only been using the gentle dispersal. And then after a while, after years of denying that there had been any pyrotechnic grenades, the evidence that they had been using them was pretty impossible to deny. And so they admitted, yes, they had been using 44 millimeter grenades and various other potentially incendiary grenades to actually get the tear gas canisters, get the tear gas grenades into the building. And they were specifically using compounds and delivery systems that are not supposed to be used indoors because they are a fire hazard. They are very flammable. They have to be used outdoors. So they were firing these things into a building with children in it. But the official stance of the government, the official ruling of the media is that the Branch Davidians themselves started the fire, and unfortunately for them, there was a bunch of flammable gas inside of there that they couldn't have known about. But they were the ones that started the fire because they were ready to commit mass suicide. So despite the fact that the evidence has changed, the story has changed, the cause of the fire has never officially changed.
Okay, so why are we talking about this? This is this is an important point, I think. So I hold a Christian nationalist view, which, I mean, just at the basics, it could be defined as a Christian nation acting in their own interest. And so you have a department like the ATF that was started maybe with good intentions, maybe not, to root out all of the illegal distribution of alcohol. I think it being started under the IRS. It was started under the IRS, correct?
Well, Treasury Department, the IRS. Remember the IRS back then? The IRS is a pretty new department too. Part of the reason that prohibition was even thinkable was that we had a new income tax, so we could stop collecting the whiskey tax. So a number of people have asked, like, well, now that we brought the whiskey taxes back, can we get rid of our income tax? Well, no, you can never get rid of a tax.
No, you can't get rid of it. Yeah, so we essentially have this department that was started to harvest more income for the government. And then, after Prohibition, they sat around, they didn't have anything to do, so they invented work for them. And it seems like the type of work that they're actually inventing for themselves to do is things like Ruby Ridge, Waco, and the poor guy with the oil canisters, amongst many other things. I've even personal contacts with friends that have FFLs that have, they're now felons because of some firearm transfer issues that are quite honestly just a joke, without getting into details on that. So you're exposing yourself to a lot of risk, even just by having an FFL and by being willing to help citizens, law-abiding citizens, to own firearms and things like that. And so you have this whole department, it seems just rife with corruption, inventing all sorts of work that results in tyranny. And so there's some conversations since Donald Trump came into office, and with the Trump administration and with Doge and all of that. And if they're actually going to clean out the government, it seems like the ATF is ripe for being removed. And so there's a lot of discussion around that. I know that you've been thinking about this. I guess the ATF, would it be as simple as Trump giving an executive order or something like that? However, the due process necessitates to get rid of a department like this. Just says with a stroke of a pen, the ATF is disbanded, it's gone. Is it that easy? Like, what would the ramifications be? How would you think through that?
Yeah. So, not being a lawyer, I can't explain why it's as complicated as it is, but apparently it's very complicated. It's actually hard to get rid of a government agency. It's kind of hard to start one. It's not hard enough, I would say. But part of the reason that Doge exists and is able to do what it does is technically it's a renamed pre-existing agency. But getting rid of an agency is difficult. Now, there's been a lot of conversation about getting rid of the ATF over the years. It was something that was discussed quite a bit during Ronald Reagan's presidency. The ATF was in the doghouse during Reagan's presidency. Actually, Joe Biden was part of the hearing. There was a congressional hearing or a Senate hearing that looked into the ATF and concluded that they were just constitutionally terrible. I forget the exact words, but they were just utterly excoriated. The results of this hearing were, you guys are not going after criminals. You're going after law-abiding Americans. There's entrapment. There's just terrible abuses of power that are happening. This is the worst. And there actually was a somewhat helpful bit of legislation passed called the Firearm Owners Protection Act that was passed in 1986. But Reagan actually considered dissolving the ATF. And one of the NRA guys was of the opinion, like, hey, this is a terrible idea because all the responsibilities will go to the FBI. A much larger and much less accountable department or bureau will end up with all of their people and all of their budget and all of their mandate. But most importantly, the bad laws will still be on the books. So that is kind of my greatest, as much as I would love to see issues related to the ATF dealt with. The laws that they are enforcing, the biggest issue with the ATF, there are these cases like Ruby Ridge, like Waco, where they are so clearly in the wrong. They are so clearly violating their oaths of office. They're violating other laws. But in some ways, the worst, most terrifying things about the ATF is when they commit grave acts of injustice against people while not disobeying the law while still upholding the 1934 National Firearms Act or some of the gun control acts from the 60s and the 70s, when they are actually upholding unjust laws that are on the books, in many ways, is a worse thing than when they violate the law and then get away with it. So I would say that we have a lot of legal stuff that we need to clean up. And just making the name BATFE go away and just shuttling some of the stuff to a new bureau is not the issue. Now, some people have wondered if that is going to happen because we have a new director of the FBI, Kash Patel, and he is also the acting director of the ATF. So putting both things under one guy, people have wondered, does that signal a future merger? And I don't know that it does, simply because there is such complexity around these things. But abolishing the ATF is kind of it's kind of a trendy slogan amongst conservative circles, and so that is a thing that occasionally there are congressmen that write bills that would abolish the ATF, which is the way that you would do it. But a bill that abolishes the ATF without getting rid of the bad laws is pretty performative, I would say.
So you have all the laws on the books. Just because you abolish the enforcement agency doesn't mean the laws go away. They still need to enforce those laws. And so what you're saying is the danger is that they go to the FBI, which has less oversight than the ATF at the moment, which is actually somewhat hard to believe. This whole theory actually, when I heard another gun tuber say, like, let's not abolish the ATF because it'll go to the FBI. And I'm like, this is the craziest thing I ever heard from like a gun tuber kind of guy.
Yeah.
It's wild.
Well, there's a couple reasons that I would like to not abolish the ATF right away. And one is I would like to see some accountability to the ATF. Now, a lot of time has passed since 1993, Waco, 1992, Ruby Ridge, but there are still guys in the agency who were in the agency at that time. I would like to see some level of accountability beyond just their job going away. I would like to see some investigations. I would like to see some of this stuff actually laid to rest. I'd like to see some of the files get declassified and released on these things. I know that all the attention is going to the JFK files and the UFO files and stuff like that. I would love to see some of these less splashy injustices really dug up and investigated. And I'd really like to see some accountability. And I'd really like to see something that is kind of lasting. Because one of the things that Donald Trump could do is he could tell the Department of Justice, take all of the firearm regulatory stuff just completely off of your to-do list. It is a low priority. Just don't do it. Do this other stuff instead for a while. And that's all well and good for 4 years. But the laws are still on the books. The next administration, if it's Democratic or, less of an outsider than Donald Trump, will just get right back onto that stuff. So the work that needs to be done needs to be a lasting work, not little temporary course corrections. The Firearm Owners Protection Act was supposed to be a pretty big course correction for the ATF. Turned out it was just like a minor speed bump for them. They wrote new definitions, they wrote new rules, and they got themselves back onto kind of their original track.
Yeah. Well, I think we would be remiss if we didn't bring up why you find Waco to be particularly interesting. Something that was really compelling about your series was that you actually were in the aftermath at Waco with your father. And I'm just curious to know, you talked about it a little bit on the series that you did on this, but what was your experience there? Kind of walk me through that.
Yeah. So I think I was about 13 years old, and I was already a weird homeschooler. Our family was already kind of in an interesting place. We were living near Washington, D.C., and my dad was doing political media at the time. Even though there wasn't much alternative media, there was starting to be. VCRs and VHS tapes had created this thing where you couldn't make a documentary that would get on CBS about some of these alternative topics, like homeschooling. There was no serious homeschool coverage on CBS. It was all just, the regular talking heads kind of talking about how weird it was. But you could make a VHS tape And on that VHS tape would be a documentary about homeschooling and how to homeschool, interviewing actual
would he sell
homeschoolers.
this through like catalogs or something like that? Was that how would
Well, catalogs were kind of developing. What you would do is you would go on I don't know if anybody remembers this, but there used to be an AM radio, and an AM radio was where all the conservatives had been banished to. So you'd go on an AM radio show and you'd say, "Hey, I made this documentary, and if you call this 1-800 number, you can give people your credit card." And sometimes you even back then had to remind people like what a credit card was, like go get a credit card and then call this 800 number, and then we'll send you a VHS tape, and then go buy a VCR, and then you can watch. So it was video
my
production
first
is
car,
so
by
much
the way,
easier
only
now.
had AM radio. It didn't even have FM radio, just AM.
Right. Yeah. So it was another world. But my dad was doing video production, campaign ads, and various other things for conservatives, for Republicans, for the most part. So we were already kind of plugged into this world. But as homeschoolers, we're also kind of, already unplugged from a lot of stuff. We were already sort of alternative people of the time. So when he got a call from a producer who said, "Hey, this thing going down in Waco is a big deal. It's a huge deal. We need to start documenting this." We jumped in the car and we went down there, and my dad had been following it. And when we got down there, there was nothing left of the compound. It had already not only burned down, but the FBI had come in and basically bulldozed everything into a big pit. Like the story is that all of the crushed cars, everything that had been run over by a tank, all that stuff was collected very carefully and meticulously by forensic folks, and they could recreate all of that. But the cleanup of the actual compound area was very fast and just pretty much wiped clean. And so I remember very vividly just seeing it and the smell of it, the signs and the fences. And one of the things that did strike me is just kind of the audacity of the government to, and at the time I was still thinking of the government in this sort of monolithic way, the audacity of the government to run this very obviously bad operation against these people and then be so confident in their ability to get away with it. They would just bulldoze the thing and leave. Like we showed up, there was a chain link fence. You could climb over it. There was nothing to stop you from coming and just shooting a documentary about this horrific thing that happened. And we interviewed a number of the survivors, former, or I don't know, it's the Branch Davidian group is kind of hard. It's hard to say whether they were current Branch Davidians or former Branch Davidians, because David Koresh is a very important figure for them. So whether they're current or ex-Branch Davidians kind of depends on whether or not he was killed or whether or not he was somewhere else. But talking to these folks who were part of this community.
If he was killed or if he was somewhere else, like they don't know if he's dead or not?
A number of the Branch Davidians believed that he got away, and some of them believe that he will be resurrected. So there's definitely some interesting beliefs about the importance of him as a prophet. But we talked to a lot of folks from this community, and a lot of them were still, it seemed like basically in shock that this had happened, that their own government had turned against them, that American tanks, American helicopters, American FBI agents had done this to them. Like it was so hard for them to believe. And if you read the testimonies of people in the trial and the people in the jury, even the people in the jury were like in disbelief that these things were like, surely the judge is not going to say that every single person in the compound committed conspiracy to kill ATF agents, to kill federal agents, and to do so with machine guns. Like, surely we that's not what we're voting on as a jury. And the judge is like, yep, that's what you're voting on as a jury. The ATF says there were machine guns there, even though none have been proven to exist. Everybody who is in there is guilty of using a federally banned automatic firearm to kill federal agents. That was kind of the way that the ruling was handed down. Everyone was just sort of in disbelief in and around Waco. The survivors and myself just seemed so alien and mind-boggling, I would say.
So I guess as a final question, we had Janet Reno as the the
She's Attorney General.
Attorney General. Thank you.
She got sworn in after the raid, while the siege was ongoing. It's kind of interesting timing. And which, by the way, would have been a perfect opportunity for her to say, hey, my predecessor did that. I am the new democratically appointed Attorney General for the Democratic Party, and I'm going to start my job as Attorney General winding this thing down. She did not do that at all. She said everything they're doing is great, and we're going to keep doing it. That was her.
Yeah, even like comparing
that was her party line.
The tanks to like rental cars, which is
yes,
ironic. And she allegedly also said something about cults and dangerous people being Bible-believing Christians that meet for Bible studies and things like that. Would you like to clarify on that?
I unfortunately put this quote into the video, and then later I did some digging. And while many people have attributed this quote to her, couldn't find any real evidence of it. But she certainly talked that way about other Christians at times. So I think the quote that I put in there is probably apocryphal. It's probably not actually hers. But
I'll just choose to believe it 100%.
Totally fell for it.
No.
Yeah.
I totally fell for it because it was true. No, I get it.
I mean, the attitude of the Clinton administration was very interesting because Bill Clinton would go to Southern Baptist churches carrying his Bible. It was a very big part of his getting elected campaign. And yet there was a disdain for Southern American Christians who had voted for him that came across in the way that he talked about gun owners, the way that he talked about pro-life advocates, the way that he talked about regular conservative American Christians. And then during the election season, of course, he claimed to basically be one. So that attitude came across clearly from him, even more clearly from Hillary, and very clearly from Janet Reno.
And so even if you throw out the quote and you just look at Ruby Ridge and Waco and the commonalities between them, it's not much of a stretch to look through some of the Christian boroughs or Christian communities that exist today to where we are saying, even Pete Hegseth, the SecDef, he said, like, take your kids out of public school. Christian education is the most important thing you should do. You should, do everything in your power to conform your life around Christian education. And so we have communities, they're Bible believing, they worship God together, they do Bible studies, they educate their kids through homeschool, or in our case, we have a very small Christian private school. There's a lot of commonalities, even if, our doctrines are different, but to pagan, what's the difference? Whether somebody has this unique theology or not, what they're seeing from the outside is an isolationist Christian community that does not participate in government education. And so, and also those communities just so happen to be very interested in firearms. And in, even there are Christian communities that have mentioned the word militia before and do training. It's a
great word, great like historical word. Yeah.
It is a really good word, constitutional even. And so you have a lot of these growing communities, especially within our spheres that we swim in, that actually have a lot of commonality between Ruby Ridge and Waco. And we still have the ATF. And even if there are some good people in the ATF, as you've mentioned before, the laws, the regulations are bad. So even if they're doing a good job executing their responsibilities, it means that necessarily they're going to be tyrannical and not using real justice in order to, protect the people and to serve the people. And so I guess, do you think that there is a risk in the future if the ATF continues without any clarification on laws and new regulations? Is there a danger of more Wacos and Ruby Ridges happening?
I think it will be very different. The reason I think it'll be different is there have been a number of changes. As tiny as a change as it feels like, saying back in 1993 there were only 3 television networks, and now there's YouTube and podcasts and Twitter. That seems like such a minor change, but I think that's a huge cultural change. I really do feel like things would have happened differently in Waco, Texas, if there had been the ability for alternative viewpoints to get out, if there had been, if the folks in that compound had Starlink, or if the people even just up the road in Waco, Texas, had the ability to talk to reporters in other outlets. There were some good reporters, some investigative reporters that tried to get on this case, but it was a different world back then. It was harder for them to get the information. It was harder for them to get their stuff published. So we live in a world where, as bad as the mainstream media continues to be, there is a greater level of freedom, informationally speaking. The other thing is, I do think there's a much higher level of education around the issue of firearms than there was back then. So if you look at even just the laws that have been passed recently, in 1993, there were a handful of states that would allow you to have a concealed carry permit. And today, the majority of states have permitless carry. And so the needle has definitely moved more towards freedom when it comes to firearm rights and firearm education and firearm safety and firearm understanding. That has been huge. So culturally speaking, on that front, it is, I think, much harder for the ATF to make a national case that a huge amount of the country gets on board with something like a Waco. Now, they are still rounding up federal air marshals and U.S. Navy personnel for violating these things, but I think that they are kind of trying to keep this as low profile as possible, because it would be very easy for them to get in some level of trouble for violating people's basic rights over some of these things like oil filters and so forth. If they had actually gone in and destroyed this guy's house and killed his wife and his kids, I think that there would be a kind of outcry that just was just as just non-existent in 1993 almost, because the people who were concerned about this were very fearful. I don't know if you remember when you were a kid, but most of your neighbors had guns, probably very few of your neighbors talked about guns. If Instagram had existed, your neighbors were probably not posting pictures of their guns on Instagram. That is a cultural shift that has changed, that is massively different. Our neighbors back in West Virginia, West Virginia, you should be fine with owning a gun. We had neighbors who were very quiet, very hush-hush about having guns. And probably for good reason. They saw what had happened to the Branch Davidians. They saw that apparently, according to the media, 99.9% of Americans were not cool with private gun ownership and were okay with feds coming in and burning down your house if you had them. So people were very skittish about this stuff in a way that today, on this issue, perhaps only on this issue, but on this issue particularly, much, much less skittish.
Well, and it is fascinating how Twitter, or X, has changed things. Even since 2020, we mentioned, the disease, the flu that went around in 2020, and how things have changed since Elon bought Twitter, bought X, and how much, that's where I go for my news. And the thing is, you look at Twitter and you look at some of the news stories and you're like, that might not be true. But you watch mainstream media and that's definitely not true. Or the narrative isn't true. Yeah. Maybe some of the facts are true, but the way that they're spinning it is not for me. It's not to my benefit. Whereas the freedom of information, the ability to live stream events that are happening, everybody has a camera in their pocket now. And so the freedom of information is really interesting. And I think the tactics probably change. I don't think that, I think I agree with you as far as a Waco sort of situation. I don't think that's probably very likely to happen, but there are different ways in which I think that they can, combat sort of people in our sphere. And it's usually through discrediting. Yeah. And it's not necessarily through a direct attack, but indirect attacks.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think that the important thing, one of the main takeaways from the ATF is that you don't just fight the symptoms. You don't just find Janet Reno and get rid of Janet Reno and then the ATF becomes nice again. You really have to look at the roots. What are the core foundations of this agency? And one of the things we didn't really touch on in Prohibition, but in that time, the turn of the century, there are massive changes in the world. There is a massive departure from Christian traditions, not just in the United States, but kind of globally. There is a belief that we can create this more scientific, this larger state. There's this idea that we'll have countries that are more modernized and more scientifically figured out and planned out, and we'll have professional bureaucrats, and we'll do things properly, and everything will be better than the way that we used to do it. And that kind of manifests itself in a bunch of different ways in different places, kind of based on the underlying culture. So in Russia, there's a very strong socialist revolution. Throughout Eastern Europe, there's people who try to run the same Russia revolution play, but depending on how many Christian foundations are still in place, they have more or less success. In Western Europe, it's much more subtle. And in America, it still has like good, solid American values attached to it. And it's like, well, we want to stop people from being drunk. So we're going to do this. We're going to stop. We're going to solve social problems with the power of good American values, but applied top down from the state. So, Woodrow Wilson, you see building the power of the state. But FDR really had massive things that he wanted to do in his New Deal. And as bad as it was, we have income tax and we have just massive new institutions being created for the federal government. The stuff that he wanted to do goes far, far beyond. He wanted to abolish all local law enforcement, have only federal law enforcement. The National Firearms Act that was passed in 1934, it banned some stuff. It was supposed to ban basically everything. It was supposed to ban handguns as well. There's no point in banning slightly more concealable rifles unless you also ban very concealable handguns. But the congressmen were like, no, our constituents, I'm sorry, we'll never be reelected if we ban just like all handguns. We're going to ban these short-barreled rifles because it's 1934. We're still shooting black powder in a lot of states, for crying out loud. This is fine. No one will care about this. But the ideas that were being tested and being rolled out across the world in the 30s, but even in the United States, were bigger, more centralized, top-down, secular, scientific statism is the answer. That's what we got to be pushing for. And so a lot of the institutions like the IRS and the ATF that were created at that time kind of have this mindset, this assumption that our goal is to manage people, not just to fight crime, but our goal is to sort of manage people. And so these are the fundamental things that we really need to fight back on. Now, the good news is we have freer voices. We've culturally made a lot of headway when it comes to firearm freedom. Just educating people about firearms, I think, has borne a lot of really good fruit over the last few decades. But there's so much more that we need to be talking about. There's so much more ground that we need to take in these different areas where people have an understanding of freedom and an understanding of responsibilities, but ultimately an understanding of the foundations that those things are built on. And in our nation, it's really unequivocally, these are Christian traditions. This is a desire to build a law code that is based on the Word of God. That is something that is so clear in our country. And by the 1920s, 1930s, the desire to get away from that starts to stand out pretty obviously.
So I guess with your, in your opinion and with your philosophy, does change like this, if we were to change regulations and eventually get to the point where we're like, oh, the ATF, they're irrelevant at this point. Is this primarily like a bottom-up change, or is this a top-down change in your view? How does change actually happen is what I'm really asking.
I think change definitely happens bottom-up. Now, if Trump is friendly and Trump wants to change some stuff at the top, that's great. If he told his guys, the ATF, like, just stop doing X, like, just stop suppressors are just not something that you have to worry about anymore. I want to see 0 convictions for suppressors unless a guy was murdered and you like mentioned that he had a suppressor when you put him on trial for murder, not put him on trial for owning an oil filter. If he said that to the ATF, I would say that's great. It's fantastic to have 4 years of breathing room to try to work on educating people about suppressors or passing actual legislation that changes the NFA. But the change really does have to come from the bottom up. If we do get breathing room from the top, that will be great. And that is one of my hopes with Donald Trump. I think that he knows that the stuff that he does for the next 4 years can just as easily be undone in many ways by whoever comes next. Because
his first administration, that was true as well. Yeah, Biden did
exactly. It got kind of wiped clean. So he did the same thing when he got in. He tried to wipe out a bunch of the stuff that Biden had done. But there is one thing I think that is really, really hard to reverse. If he does manage to shut stuff down and pass that power and that money back down to the states, whenever the next Democratic president gets in there, the states will fight that guy. Like even the blue states, in some ways, maybe especially the blue states, will fight to keep their power and their money out of the federal government's hands once they get it back. So in some ways, the most effective long-term thing that Donald Trump can do from a tactical perspective, everything that he wants shut down and out of the hands of the government, give it to the states. And then the states will do their best to hang on to it. But ultimately, I do agree that positive change is going to involve bottom-up movement. You can't really decentralize from the top nearly as effectively as you can centralize from the top.
That's very fascinating, and may the Lord actually bless us during these 4 years and change and bless God's people during these next 4 years, and not just have some cheap political points, because you can see the temptation.
Yes.
Doge comes in and is like, oh yeah, we're not doing trannies anymore in the military, and it's like just earns some cheap political points with conservatives to make it appear like they're actually accomplishing something. I really do pray and hope that real change does actually happen, and it actually does stick for the future and for our generations.
Yeah.
I wanted to thank you for joining us on the King's Hall. Isaac Botkin, I mean, what a legend, this guy. Please go and buy a holster, buy some body armor, support T.REX Arms.
Yeah.
Great godly men, godly company, really is a stalwart in their community and is blessing their people there. And so thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciated your time, and thank you for listening to the King's Hall.
Thank you so much.
Stay safe. Mask up. Get the vax. Don't take unnecessary risks. Be careful. We've been coddled, smothered in warnings, trained to fear and avoid risk. We've been taught to play it safe and be on our guard. And not just against a scraped knee or a failed endeavor. No, we've been taught to censor our speech, our words, even our thoughts. Don't think those dangerous thoughts. Don't notice. Don't speak out. If you do, we're coming for you. Who's coming for you? It almost doesn't even matter. Whether it's the HR lady at your company of either sex, weaponized church courts, the social media censors, or even those you once considered allies. Watch out. Take care. Play it safe. But was it always this way? Have we always lived under this kind of stifling, wet blanketing panopticon? Is this the spirit of our Christian forefathers? Of the men who founded our nation in blood and in faith? Willing to face down all the might of Britannia and her redcoats? There was a time when Americans didn't shrink from risk, when they would rather die than bend. Our Christian forefathers knew what it was to draw the sword and throw away the scabbard. They knew what it was to set sail for the unknown. They defied tyrants. They built, explored, and dared great things. Who settled this land? Who built one of the greatest nations ever to be? Who settled the West and covered the continent from sea to sea with a Christian people? Who searched out glories, crisscrossed the plains with railroads, and fought off usurpers and invaders on all sides? Risk wasn't a bug, it was a feature. Without it, our fathers knew, there was no greatness. And now, we're supposed to trade boldness for bureaucracy? We're supposed to tremble at the unknown instead of mastering it? We're supposed to bow and scrape, not even before bullets, but before HR ladies? We don't think so. It's time to remember who we are. This year, join us here at New Christendom Press for our annual conference, Safety Third, Recovering the American Will to Greatness. 4 days to forge new friendships, build coalition, and work to recover what was lost. It's time to reclaim the spirit that built this nation, to break free from fear, to risk, to build, to lead. The future belongs to the bold.